Welcome to the Current Trends in Ag-gag panel. So I'm just going to introduce myself and then the panelists. My name is Lydia. I'm an undergraduate student at New York University studying human rights and animal studies, and I'm involved with SALDF there. And so as for our panelists, we have Chloe Waterman, who's the Senior Manager of State Legislative Strategy for the ASPCA, and we have Chris Green, who's the Director of Legislative Affairs for ALDF. And so they're going to talk about trends in ag-gag laws, and I think Chloe's going to speak first about the history, so do you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Lydia, and thanks for having us here. Can we just do real quick a show of hands for who was in the last ag-gag panel? Was everybody in? Okay, almost everybody. Okay, cool. That's helpful. So ag-gag.
Questions.
Yeah, exactly. Just start with questions. So ag-gag, just really, I mean, it seems like almost all of you were in there, but ag-gag laws are laws that are designed to impede whistleblowing on agricultural operations in particular, and we'll get more into that, but just before we do, some of you may be wondering, the ASPCA and farm animals, you know, you've probably seen our fundraising ads with Sarah McLachlan, and she makes you feel very guilty, I feel, or she either makes you donate or feel guilty, one or the other.
Change the channel.
and you've changed the channel, but we actually do have a long and kind of storied history in farm animal work. It was actually farm animal work that helped spur the founding of the ASPCA back in 1866, and we supported the very first federal law on the books for animals, the 28-hour law, which protects farm animals. And we've been involved in humane law enforcement, not only for dogs and cats, but we've also been involved in the inspections of slaughterhouses. We even had an ASPCA patented humane slaughtering kind of machine that we promoted. And then we have a farm animal welfare campaign that formed a couple years ago, and we have launched a Truth About Chicken campaign that's part of that, urging consumers to demand and the industry to supply slower growing chickens. We knew we were successful when the National Chicken Council copied our campaign with the real truth about chicken, but then we got the URL, the really real truth about chicken, and the battle continues. We also have an Open the Barns campaign that is designed largely around the ag-gag issue, recognizing that ag-gag implicates not only agricultural facilities, but also puppy mills, which is another primary area that the ASPCA works in. And so this is a social media campaign, so here's just some of the social media that has come out of this. So just a little bit of the background, undercover on the farm, the value of these undercover investigations. I think we heard a little bit in the last session about Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, a 1906 expose on the Chicago meatpacking industry that led to the passage of the Federal Meat Inspection Act and eventually the creation of the FDA. And you'll see that starting from there through the investigations that are happening now, these undercover whistleblower investigations are prompting industry reform. They are leading to an incredible number of cruelty convictions, which is, as you've heard in some of the previous panels, very difficult to get because of some of the exemptions that exist for animal agriculture, but the evidence is quite damning, and the public becomes very enthused about these cases and demands change. And Chris is going to talk more too about the impact these investigations have had, and they absolutely do have a demand on consumer demand for meat. We have there is a legislator in Montana that sponsored the Ag-gag bill there this past year that said, I'm doing this because these videos are the greatest threat to agriculture. That's why these videos are happening, is because they do have an impact. So there is a lot at stake here. And you've seen some images today, and I get bonus points. I'm not going to show you a video. Chris is, so he's going to be the bad guy here. This is from the Hallmark case, which I think Chris is going to talk about as well, but there was, I think, 153 million pounds of beef recalled as a result of this case, exposing downed calves being sent to slaughter, eventually ending up in a school lunch program for free and reduced lunch through the USDA. So just a little bit about the history of Ag-gag, how we got here. I think it's fair to start the history of Ag-gag with the Animal Enterprise Protection Act of 1992, which was then ultimately amended to the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act in 2006. Let me see if I can get my quote to pull up here. So this act it criminalizes basically interference with agricultural operations, but it's written, and nobody endorsed it. None of our organizations endorse terrorism, and none of these activities, these undercover videos, constitute terrorism in any way. But the way that these laws are written so broadly, where economic damage is defined as the loss of profits from threats, property damage, trespass, harassment, intimidation, and then it also creates a tertiary relationship, any connection to, relationship with, or transactions with the animal enterprise is so broad that the fear is that it will have a chilling effect on these investigations. And these animal enterprise terrorism laws were not only passed at the federal level, but most states have adopted them now, Minnesota first in 1988. And the first Ag-gag laws passed with these Animal Enterprise Terrorism Acts. So the first Ag-gag laws were framed as, with animal activists as terrorists, rather than whistleblowers, rather than people that are exposing this cruelty to the public. So here's Kansas's, and it was the very first Ag-gag law in 1990. And I should say, nobody at this time was paying attention to these bills. The animal welfare movement did not notice these. We didn't see they were passing. In the early 90s, there wasn't nearly the presence that there is working on the state legislative level that there is now. And here's Montana's crime to take pictures by photograph, video camera, or other means. And this is where some people say that they think this doesn't count it as Ag-gag because it requires an intent for criminal defamation. So, what these videos are showing is true. The intent is not to criminally defame these business owners. It's to expose this abuse to the public. And so we don't feel that these videos meet the definition. However, surely there would be litigation around this, and that can be expensive and a deterrent enough from doing the investigations in states that have laws like Montana's.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, that's a really important point, that they the other side tries to frame that they're doing something illicit, but it is a defense to defamation is if it's actually what you're saying is true. And so if you film something that's occurred, there's no real way for that what it's saying is the truth, so there's no real way for that to in any way be defamatory unless you've somehow animated what's going on. You can even edit and do what you want, but it's still actually true because it's only documenting something that actually happened.
Yeah, exactly. And then North Dakota also was the third state in this early wave of Ag-gag laws. And then just quickly, Aggag and the American Legislative Exchange Council, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, ALEC is a very conservative group that many of the most conservative legislators belong to, and they put out kind of model legislation. They really operate in the shadows. They don't release their legislation publicly, or haven't traditionally in the past, but we've definitely found the connection. This is an ALEC publication right there that contains this model Ag-gag law that was based off of Montana's law, and they put this out in 2002. And then that became the basis for this kind of second wave of Ag-gag laws that we saw starting in 2010. So again, 1990, 1991 actually, we saw these three laws in place. 2011 was when these laws started cropping up again, and Iowa's passed that first year, and bills were defeated in Minnesota, New York, and Florida. And these were mostly of the kind of original brand of Ag-gag, like those early ones that just straight up prohibit the taking photographs and video on agricultural operations and misrepresentation on a job application. And then the next year, 2012, we had Missouri passed in 2012, and that one was the quick reporting bill that had quick reporting as well as misrepresentation, I think, and it was a significantly watered down version than from what was originally introduced. Utah passed that year as well, and so we were up to 6. The next year, 2013, this was kind of the year of the Ag-gag bills, and our best, we were, I think, 11-0 this year. That year, no bills passed into law, and there was a ton of media coverage, really positive media coverage on Ag-gag that year. But you can just see how the industry catches whiff of this trend, and then all of a sudden you see all of these states trying the same thing. Yeah, Chris.
If I could add to, kind of like the example I gave at lunch, in 2013, it was May 13th, it was my first day on the job at ALDF, and that's when Governor Haslam in Tennessee vetoed the Ag-gag bill that had passed both houses there, and again, based on the opinion of his Attorney General, saying that there was a high likelihood that it was unconstitutional, but again, that's just, you have no idea how much of a massive gutsy step that is for a Republican governor to veto a pro-ag bill in his own state.
And it helped. I mean, it helped us a lot in other states. And you'll see, I think, so going to the 2015 map, which has a lot more colors, and I'll explain this soon, but one of the things that sticks out to me the most, and it gives me the greatest feeling of success, is that we see states like Tennessee and Indiana done with Ag-gag. I mean, I think that, sure, it's not that these states have given up on trying to reduce protections for farm animals or keep farm animal abuse in the dark, but after a while, once our strategy in those states had been to make Ag-gag such a controversial hot-button issue that legislators didn't want to deal with it. There are always going to be certain proponents of Ag-gag that are from really rural districts, and their constituents are fine with Ag-gag. But leadership and other legislators around the state want to stay away. Our goal is to get them to want to stay away from the issue, and I think we really succeeded at that. And that's why leadership in Tennessee, they hated it. I mean, it's no legislature wants the governor to be vetoing their bills, and so they get a whiff of how controversial this is, and then that helps shut us down. And so seeing those states blank in here gives me a lot of hope. And Chris and I are going to go into some case studies too after this, and we want to hear from you too. But then we'll talk a little bit more in the case study section. But there are some states on here where we're seeing non-traditional Ag-gag, and by that I mean Ag-gag that falls outside of the categories of this just straight up prohibition on videotaping and taking photographs on agricultural operations, misrepresentation on a job application, and these quick reporting bills. And Chris will talk more about the quick reporting bills, and we'll go through the New Hampshire case example. But in the last session, Justin talked about Wyoming. We'll go into that one more. But and then Arizona, it wasn't exactly Ag-gag, and that's in our case studies too. But it required anybody who's investigating animal cruelty to notify the Department of Agriculture in their investigation. So again, not just the straight up prohibition, but something that would interfere with investigations of these facilities. And then Missouri already has an Ag-gag law, but that is just not enough for the state of Missouri. They come up with that's where like all of the bad stuff originates. Like all of this stuff comes out of Missouri, I swear. So they have this kind of like data gag law, basically, where they say that any information pertaining to agriculture or animal health cannot be FOIA'd. Yeah,
just to throw in a comic aside, there's a group called the Missouri Alliance for Animal Legislation by a guy named Bob Baker, and he's worked in several states, and he says Missouri is the absolute worst state for animals legislatively. And you'll get emails from different state groups where they're like celebrating, like, hey, look at what we accomplished during the session. And theirs is like, their last one has a picture of this dog peeking out from under the couch saying, the session finally ended, it's safe for the animals to come back out. And like, here's a list of all the crazy crap we managed to kill.
It's all defensive,
They had a bill last year that would allow people to spay and neuter their own pets.
Oh.
I mean, just insane stuff. I mean, and that's because it's puppy mills. They don't have to pay vets.
I mean, and we were talking earlier about exemptions, animal cruelty exemptions, and there are very broad exemptions for farm animals in the law. There's also that comes from the tradition of animals being conceived as property, and there are also states that have exemptions basically for acts that you do to your own animal. And Missouri has that, and it's very broad, and it got some attention last year when there was a guy that drowned his girlfriend's cat at her request. And there's just a straight up exemption in the law for abusing your own animal because it's your property and you can do what you want to your property. So that's just kind of a tangent on like how bad Missouri is, but we could do a whole presentation.
He drowned it in their subdivision by putting in the cat carrier in the little lake that's at their subdivision in front of all the neighbors as he's drowning it, and there was like nothing anyone could do about it. It's totally legal in Missouri.
I gotta say, I'm from Missouri and I can attest to that. It's a horrible state for animals.
And then we also, just before we go into the case studies too, Montana, you may have noticed, turned from dark brown, having an Ag-gag law, back to bright red. So this is starting to be another theme, is like these states that passed Ag-gag laws already. They're like, yeah, what more can we do? You know, because some of it is like a glory issue for some of these legislators that they want to be seen doing. They revile groups that do undercover investigations, and they really want to just do whatever they can, regardless of whether it has an actual impact, to show that these investigations have no place in their state and agriculture is sacred and protected. So Montana we talked earlier about they have the ban on taking photograph or video with the intent to criminally defame. And that's enough to keep investigators out of the state. And there have been no investigations by any national group in Montana, to my knowledge, or anyone that I've spoken to. But the legislature still went, and they are trying to do a quick reporting bill in Montana. That they still have, you know, a couple weeks in their session, so we're not, you know, grave dancing just yet. But it's looking like it won't pass. But you know, it's just I think it just demonstrates that like this fight is going to continue, and it's just about changing forms. So here's our cumulative record, which is really a winning record. You know, we have defeated Aggag now. I think after this session, it's like 19 states so far, and it's passed in 7 or 4 since the resurgence in 2011. A lot of our success has been due to the response by the media and by the public. We've gotten some great coverage, including this from The Daily Show. Al Madrigal talking to Emily Meredith. Perhaps Animal Agriculture Alliance is not their best spokesperson, but you know. So let me get this straight: you're protecting the animals from the people who are trying to protect the animals. You know, I think once the public hears about these laws, it's certainly very intuitive how backwards this is. And the industry has responded as well. This is from the National Pork Producers Council. This was in Minnesota, Farm Fest in Minnesota. 99% about the story of the Ag-gag stories were negative. In Temple Grandin, Ag-gag bills are the stupidest thing that Ag ever did. So even I think the industry is acknowledging, hey, this does not make us look good to the public. What do we have? What are we trying to hide here? That's what consumers are asking. They're losing confidence in the industry. And so another great part of our success has been the coalition effort on these bills. You know, we have reached well outside of animal groups because Ag-gag bills implicate so many other interests. I think the presentations this morning were a great demonstration of that. The first presentation this morning focusing on North Carolina, there are environmental justice issues at stake here. And North Carolina happens to have one of the most expansive Ag-gag bills that we've seen before this year. It applies not just to agricultural operations, but it gives a right of action to any private business owner whose employee has breached their duty of loyalty or videotaped or recorded something without authorization. And so that applies not only to an undercover investigator like TJ, but to somebody who is investigating elder abuse at a nursing home or child abuse at a daycare. So a lot of different workers' rights and consumer justice issues come into play with these, and we've engaged a very large coalition that has been successful in this. So with that, I will turn it over to Chris. Here's kind of my information, which we can put up at the end. And I did want to mention too, just before that we have an internship program at the ASPCA through our DC office and through our New York City office, and we have a lot of law students and undergraduates that come through our internship program. It was how I found my place at the ASPCA, and so if anybody is interested in interning, my email is up there, so you can get in touch. With that, turn it over to my buddy Chris.
While I'm pulling mine up, just to echo what Chloe said about the ASPCA, they have been people think of them as in terms of companion animals primarily, but they have been super active. You know, it's like going in and hiring contract lobbyists and really leading the charge in many of these states. There's a coalition of groups that work on farm animal protection. We have a weekly call, and where everyone just kind of updates each other, because that's the problem with legislation. You know, there's obviously 50 states. There's dozens. You know, legislatures. I think New Hampshire alone has the 4th largest legislative body in the English-speaking world. And so there's literally like 450 legislators just in New Hampshire, and anyone can get a wild hair and just introduce some bill, and you need to know about it. So a big part of what we do is tracking all of that just to know, hey, this just happened, we all need to focus on it, and the AA has been great about that. Some of the ones, I think Wyoming specifically, Daisy was the first one to ring the bell, like, holy crap, has anybody seen it? It's like, what's so let me pull up, all right.
What's it mean to get a wild hair?
I can't say the rest of that, but you can, a wild hair in part of your body. So I get to be the bad guy, and want to talk about why this is important. I mean, you saw how much this impacted TJ, and that showed how much it impacted him directly as an individual. But I kind of want to start off showing the impact that these investigations have on the general public. So I'm going to show you, it's only a minute or two, and it's not super gory, but you'll get an idea of what this is about. What's going on here? These are cows that are too sick to come walking around, that have to use machinery to. Knife. Those are wounds. So that was just one investigation at one place that was actually chosen randomly and gathered in just a pretty short period of time. The good news is that as a result of what you just saw, each of those four of the people, each one of them you saw in the video, were charged multiple counts of cruelty and convicted. But as TJ was saying, often it's harder to have an impact on the actual people directing that, the managers and the plant owners. Unfortunately, it's often just the lower income workers that are scapegoated. But in this case, Wheat Brothers Farms gave their milk to an intermediary that supplied DiGiorno Pizza, which is owned by Nestle. DiGiorno said they would not accept any further cheese made with milk from that dairy. And it's not some small operation, it's 4,500 cows. So that was pretty much their entire business. And then on a much larger global scale, Nestle, who most people think of related to like chocolate milk, they're actually the world's largest food company, do $101 billion worth of business each year. And as a result of that video, primarily entered into negotiations with Animal Protection Movement and said that Nestle was going to require sweeping across the board animal welfare improvements from all the 7,300 suppliers, each of which have a bunch of other farms. So no more tail docking, no more dehorning of calves, no more gestation crates or battery cages. And this was literally going to affect hundreds of thousands of farms worldwide. So as sad as it was to watch that a couple weeks of that investigation had a massive sweeping worldwide effect. which is exactly why the ag industry never wants you to see another one of those again. And so, as you see here, an article from Kansas State, one of the larger ag schools, you see the cutout there. As a whole, media attention to animal welfare has significant negative effects on U.S. meat demand. The previous panel talked a little bit about the impact of these videos, and I saw an infographic that talked about the increase in people becoming vegetarian and vegan in the last, I think, 5 years, and it was a dramatic increase. And 46% of those who had made that change said it was on the basis of watching a video online. So it didn't specifically say whether that was an undercover investigation video or was sort of like a vegetarian starter kit video, but I think that's just goes to show the immense power of the visual media and online access. And full disclosure, my great uncle Charlie was actually head of the dairy department at Kansas State University for about 20 years. I currently manage a farm that's remained in my family for 178 years in Illinois. So I come at this from having a long 6th generation. I mean, that land was cleared by my great-great-great-grandfather 6 generations ago. So, you know, I come at this from an understanding that, in my opinion, all of this gives agriculture a bad name. When you see videos like that, they paint everyone with the same brush. And I think we have a duty to root out the bad actors who are actually law-breaking. And it's not a matter of just, hey, we don't think this is right. Like what you saw in that video is absolutely criminally, it's against the law. It's flat-out law-breaking. And so when I'm arguing before a state legislature in Arizona, for example, it's great to be able to play this card. It's like, oh, you animal rights person coming in here telling us what to do. You don't understand agriculture. I'm like, I manage a farm that's been in my family 75 years longer than Arizona's even been a state. So don't you tell me that I don't understand the needs of agriculture. So we talked a little about the origins there. But as you saw, some of the bills or the laws that Chloe referred to earlier had these really interesting names. They're sort of like the Animal Research Facility Damage Act and the Farm Animal Research Facilities Protection Act, because there was this sort of hysteria that there was these lab trashings going on all over the place and these animal rights extremists were coming in and destroying things. So that's what these are sort of passed in response to, but it's sort of like trespassing is already illegal. The criminal damage of property is already illegal. It was just sort of, a lot of them were just sort of making them extra illegal or sort of passed for show. But as Will Potter, who's written about this as much as anybody, said, the current problem is not that animal activists are out breaking windows, it's that they're creating them, as you saw with that video. It's not that they're trashing labs, it's that they're exposing what's going on behind closed doors. And so the current element, so I call it after ALEC got involved. How many people are here are familiar with the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC? So just to let you know, there's sort of this conservative corporate bill mill, very well funded, very effective at what they do. They were the ones behind the stand your ground laws in Florida and elsewhere that led to the death of Trayvon Martin. They were the ones in Virginia behind the law that would require women to have the invasive ultrasound before being allowed to consult for terminating a pregnancy. Just a bunch of horrible conservative stuff in this.
Voter ID.
Yeah, exactly, voter ID. There's really huge behind that. And so, interestingly, the Ag-gag provision was considered too extreme even for the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which people think is one of the worst anti-animal bills passed. And so they dusted off and then tried it again at the state level. And these are some of the elements, criminalizing recording straight out, criminalizing obtaining a job under false pretenses. So if you don't mention that you've got a college degree or you use some sort of false information, even though you're performing the job perfectly as directed, that's illegal in 3 states now. And then the one we're probably going to talk about the most, they kind of got smart and led to what's called quick reporting of all suspected abuse. So in Missouri, it's 12 hours. So you have to turn over all the evidence, and we'll get into a little bit about why that's the case. So the Daily Show clip that you saw, or photo that you saw, there's a group called the Animal Agriculture Alliance, and they are the primary trade organization that is behind these Ag-gag laws. There's 2 primary people, Kate Johnson-Smith, who, I don't know, many of you may know Marianne Sullivan. She just debated her in New York a couple weeks ago, and then Emily Meredith. And they've actually said in writing that these quick reporting bills are going to be their strategic focus of their legislative strategy. And they even kind of borrow New York's anti-terrorism slogan saying, if you see something, say something. It's that simple. I mean, if there's cruelty going on, these farmers want to know about it too. but as Justin alluded to, there's more to it. They really want, the whole goal there is not to root out the cruelty, the goal is to root out the investigators. So, as TJ mentioned, some prosecutors will not go after a manager or a plant owner unless you can first document that there's quote unquote a pattern of abuse. So, but yet if you go to them with evidence of just what you saw in one day, it's like, well, that's just one day. How do we know that the manager knew what was going on? And so the classic example of this is the 2008 Hallmark investigation, which Chloe showed you a couple photos of. There, the Humane Society went into a large facility in California and filmed all this outright law breaking going on. And so another thing you hear is that all these animal rights groups, they come in and they take all this video and then they sit on it and they just edit it and they just wait for a really opportune time so they can fundraise off of it. Well, it's actually the other way around. It's usually not the animal protection groups that are dragging this out. It's the folks who are supposed to be actually investigating and inspecting these plants and enforcing the laws. So with the Hallmark case, HSUS takes a week worth of footage. They go to the USDA, even though there's USDA inspectors at the plant where all of this is going on, and said, look at all this. You've got this blatant law breaking, animal cruelty going on, like sick and diseased cattle being dragged into the food supply. Like, you need to get in there and do something. And they're like, we don't really see it. So HSUS goes back for another week. The other investigators stay another week, gets another week's worth of footage, comes back and says, oh my God, look, there's even more. I mean, this is obviously like systemic here. If this is continuing to happen, USDA is like, we don't really see it. Investigator stays in there, gets even more footage, goes back to USDA a third time. USDA, same thing, like, well, sorry, you can keep coming back here as much as you want, but we don't really think this rises to the level that we need to take any action. So HSUS puts the video out in the public eye, all hell breaks loose. It leads to the single largest beef recall in U.S. history. 143 million pounds of beef being recalled, 37 million pounds of which was slated for the school lunch program. Sick and diseased cattle, too sick to stand, being dragged and put into the food supply. And so, sorry, go back. And so, what would happen basically if you had that quick reporting requirement, you never would have been able to, you never would have had that. All that would have happened, the analogy is like, say you've got a drug syndicate that you've got a DEA agent has spent months infiltrating to get into some drug cartel, and you're trying to stop drugs coming into the country. Having these quick reporting requirements would be the equivalent of requiring that DEA agent to reveal themselves the moment they see a $5 drug buy. So what's going to be the result of that? The only people you're going to ever catch are the people doing the hand-to-hand drug sales on the street. You're certainly never going to be able to get the cartel head who's importing this stuff into the country. The exact same thing here. So it's not if you see something, say something. It's like if you see something, say something, so we can identify you, fire you, and make sure you don't see anything else. And more importantly, make sure you don't show it to anybody else. So the current trends, the past couple of years, as Chloe showed, we've been extremely successful. So there have been 25 Ag-gag anti-whistleblower bills introduced across 17 states. Every single one of those except for one was defeated by the combined efforts of all the animal protection groups. Idaho is the only one to pass, and as Justin mentioned, they filed suit against that law within 3 weeks, and there's going to be, just next week, there's going to be a hearing, and it's looking pretty positive that might invalidate the law as unconstitutional. And this year so far, we've had 6 official bills. New North Carolina just got introduced. We're still expecting one in Wisconsin. I was just up there last week. We'll see what happens. And mentioned Wyoming was sort of unique. But the latest strategy is that they're trying to really paint these and kind of put the wolf in sheep's clothing and hide these as anti-cruelty measures. So what we're going to do now is kind of walk through a few case studies and that we've all been involved with, and just kind of walk through them and ask you guys some questions and try and move through. So you want to talk about Indiana first?
Yeah, sure, cool. So Indiana, I mentioned this briefly earlier, it was one of the earlier ones that we saw starting in 2012, and then 2015 we finally didn't see it again, which would have been a victory were they not now trying something even more dangerous, arguably. So in 2013, the Senate Bill 373 was introduced, and this bill started, by the end, it had encompassed every kind of possible approach to Ag-gag. and the bill they were debating at the end, they had just thrown everything into it. And this was just such a mess kind of politically. You know, it went through the Senate in a really strong form. The House, our key to success in the House was that we got it assigned to the Judiciary Committee. So animal bills typically get assigned either to like an Agriculture Committee or a Judiciary Committee. And we usually prefer that Judiciary Committee because for these Ag-gag bills, because they tend to have more lawyers on them, and they can possibly find some of the many constitutional issues that these bills have. So that committee watered it down. So then there were two different bills, and they had to have a conference committee at the very end of session to work out the differences between the two bills. Typically, conference committees consist of like two legislators in the majority and one in the minority from each chamber, and this started out like that, but when they weren't coming to an agreement, because we had some good Democrats on the conference committee and a Republican from that Judiciary Committee that were strong, leadership just kicked the Democrats off the conference committee, which you just don't see happen very much, but it's happened like on the very last day of session. And this bill was defeated on the floor. It was pulled from the floor after an excellent debate. And I wanted to have the Indiana example on here because so often I think these bills are kind of defeated behind the scenes, and that's great and that's really important. And this was truly, I think, on the merits of the bill because it was a new bill that had come out on the last day of session that had come out of this conference committee. And they talked in the debate about the jungle and about, it was right after the explosions in East Texas, and they talked about what would have happened, you know, what if there had been an investigator there and they couldn't have said anything about these cases. So that was really nice. We had a good defeat. And then the next year they had this very peculiar bill, which I think if I highlighted, no, I haven't. Sorry. Basically this kind of like create your own felony law. So you could, if you were, like if you owned an agricultural operation, you could just post a notice somewhere on your operation that people are likely to see that just says, here are things you can't do in the operation, and these are all going to be felonies. So like you really can't just like write in your own felony right there. So sometimes the how far-reaching our opponents try to go can work in our favor. To get these defeated, and that bill did. Ultimately, it passed into law, but not with any of the Ag-gag language. It basically became kind of an enhanced trespassing law, which we didn't take a position on. Sorry. And then, but now, 2015, this isn't the first time that right to farm has been introduced in Indiana, and it probably won't be the last either, but there was a right to farm statute that was passed last year in 2014. And basically what these right to farm bills can come in a couple of different forms, some more serious than others. Some of them are basically just resolutions that are there for show that say, hey, we all have the right to farm, farming is great, and they don't really have the force of law. But others of them are very threatening, and they basically enshrine a right to farm, just like we have, you know, the right to bodily liberty and the other rights that we are afforded in the Constitution. They put a right to farm in the Constitution. And so what we think that would do, it's yet to be seen because these laws are fairly new, and there are some right to fish and hunt laws that are from earlier too, but there's not really any case law around this yet. But what we think they would do is preclude both the legislature and in states where there are voter ballot initiative options, preclude the legislature from passing any laws that infringe on farming, including bans on certain forms of extreme confinement, zoning regulations, environmental regulations. There are a host of laws that would be impacted by this, and so it's yet to see. But we're very frightened. Indiana passed one as a statute and then came back and tried to pass it as a constitutional amendment this last year. Indiana has one of the most burdensome kind of requirements for amending the Constitution. 2 consecutive legislatures have to pass the resolution, and then the voters have to approve it. So this failed this year on a floor vote, which was pretty miraculous. It broke down over the issue of growing hemp. So we'll take it.
See whatever you get.
Yeah, whatever we can get. But this is a theme we're seeing, and we wanted to bring it up because I do think that, again, we're not going to see. We might see some of the more traditional forms of Ag-gag go away and kind of wait out, but our opposition, the stakes are too high for them. They really have something to hide. They're showing it. So we are seeing a lot of these kind of new approaches to keep farm animal abuse in the dark and to reduce the already minimal protections for farm animals on the books. These are happening because of our success, because the Humane Society of the U.S. has had so much success passing ballot measures to ban extreme forms of confinement in certain states. So we're fighting a right to farm constitutional amendment in Oklahoma right now, for instance, where there is a citizen initiative process that's been used before to pass a law making cockfighting illegal. So that would be an avenue that would be available to animal advocates down the road if the legislature refuses to act on some of these issues, which, knowing Oklahoma, they very may will.
And similar to, if I can jump in real quick, similar to kind of like how Ag-gag has been such a great moniker to use to let the public know exactly what these laws are doing. We've kind of started calling these, instead of right to farm, right to harm, because that's basically what you're doing is you're giving agribusiness and corporations the unfettered right to harm local communities, and you're taking away from those communities the right. So some of the state statutes first did was just remove agriculture from the nuisance laws. So if someone builds this massive, pig facility next to you and devalues your property because everything smells like pig manure, you're not allowed to go use the nuisance laws to get them to abate that. And it just so there's one in Hawaii again this year as well. And so then the next step is then preventing local communities, but now what Chloe was saying is like the states amending the Constitution to prevent the state's own legislature from being able to do anything in the future, and it's really frightening.
And I will say too, so every state or about every state has something like a right to farm law on the books that limits nuisance suits that can be filed on agricultural operations, and some of them have protections for zoning and things like that. And this is an area that I definitely think could use some more research to see how these laws have been used and are impacting animal agriculture. But the new wave that we're seeing, especially these constitutional amendments, are definitely of a different variety and are definitely a threat to advancing animal protection. And
just yesterday I heard of the latest flavor of this in Missouri. Mm-hmm. They're trying to pass a law saying that any county that doesn't have any quote-unquote restrictions on agriculture gets an automatic 5% bonus in grant money from something. So again, it's like trying to, so even if they do pass something, now the state's creating financial incentives to create this sort of race to the bottom.
Yeah, and Missouri did pass just this last, that was just this last election cycle. They passed a right to farm constitutional amendment. They amended their constitution. They won by like this minuscule number of votes, and it was extremely painful for us. But it shows that we can win these if they get to the voters. But as Chris has alluded to, it's difficult politically. It doesn't sound good to oppose the right to farm, but we have to make people understand that it is a right to harm. Farming is protected just as people are protected, are free to and enjoy protection under the law to pursue whatever legal career they might have. But holding farming above all of these at the expense of neighbors and animals and the environment, the community as a whole is not something that's going to serve us. Chris, do you want to do Colorado?
Sure. So Colorado kind of got smart. They watched what some other states had done, and they were going to try and do something last year, and they chose not to. We kind of managed to scare them into not doing a traditional bill. So they went away and they worked. And we'll talk about Arizona in a sec, but they tried to borrow from Arizona, where they're basically trying to drive a wedge into the animal protection community between those that are promoting and more interested in companion animal issues and farm animal issues, trying to kind of bifurcate that. So they came up with this mandatory reporting bill that says oh, we just want to make sure that all cruelty is reported. So, and we'll apply this to all animals. And so it enumerates a whole list of different individuals and professions that are required to report suspected cruelty within 48 hours. So this includes veterinarians, even though there was already something in the Veterinary Practice Act that required this, and actually this might actually conflict with that, which helped us. But groomers, trainers, even therapists and psychologists were required to report if they suspected any animal cruelty. So this sort of sounds like a good thing. If you're like a person who works at a shelter and you see a lot of animal cruelty on a regular basis, you're like, oh, this is something we would be behind. So it has this whole list. I think there were 24 of them. 23. The very, very, very last one, V, said, oh, and also, quote, anyone who has reasonable cause to know or suspect that an animal has been abandoned, mistreated, or neglected. That's the undercover investigator. And that was the whole purpose of the law. They always say the devil is in the details. It's the very last provision, and that's what they were trying to shut down. And this was a real problem because you had several of the groups on the ground, the larger Colorado animal protection groups, were sort of either neutral or supporting this bill, and we sort of look like the bad guys coming in from the outside, like, no, this is actually really bad, and it won't just affect Colorado. If you allow this to happen, this is going to give a playbook to every other state and show how they can get these Ag-gag quick reporting bills passed. So this is exactly what we were just talking about. This requires any undercover investigator who witnesses, not only just records, but just witnesses cruelty to reveal themselves and report it within 48 hours.
And
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add, I mean, this wasn't just reporting to law enforcement. You could report it to law enforcement or the animal's owner. So, I mean, we support mandatory reporting of animal cruelty for veterinarians, or really any mandatory reporting of animal cruelty that will actually lead to prosecutions. But, if a veterinarian who suspects that somebody is fighting their dogs can just report it to that owner, what good is that going to do? So that made it so clear that their intentions were truly insidious.
Yeah.
Or if you're the employee of a factory farm that's doing this, you can discharge your duties by just reporting it to your boss who told you to do it in the first place.
Yeah.
And so therefore, and then it goes away. Justin, who was here, he and I worked on an op-ed. He got 5 of his other constitutional law professors at the University of Denver to sign this open letter that was in the Denver Post, and it was really great at branding this for the Ag-gag bill it was, and we managed to kill it in committee. So again, part of the luck continues, or the work. So New Hampshire, do you want to go first on New Hampshire? You guys were both pretty involved in that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so New Hampshire was another quick reporting bill, and it had a time frame of 24 hours. And there were some interesting nuances about New Hampshire. So, first of all, it was only applied to cruelty against livestock. And then you had to submit the recordings to law enforcement, but only if there was a recording from it. So it created kind of this weird situation. So say you had both John and Linda who witnessed an act of animal cruelty to livestock. Say on the side of the road they see a cow that they think has been beaten. And Linda records it because she gets out her cell phone and she has her cell phone. But what's the other character I made up? John? John gets out his phone and his battery is dead. So John can't record it. So then there are the law provides different requirements on Linda and John. Not only that, so Linda, if she records this, and say she's not sure, whether this is abuse or not, and she waits more than 24 hours to report it, she would be in violation of the law for reporting it. So it absolutely would chill whistleblowing in that way. Whereas John, he can report that anytime and face no penalty. So it creates this kind of weird disparity between somebody that records the information and somebody that just witnesses the information. Yeah.
And if I can add, what made this even more insidious is that cruelty to livestock wasn't even illegal. So their livestock's kind of exempted from their cruelty code already,
Yeah.
and so they had to do some weird gymnastics in the statute. So it says anyone who sees someone witnessing all this stuff that's illegal to do to cats and dogs, if you witness someone doing that to livestock, you're legally required to report it, even though it's not clear that actually. So the way they worded it was just showed all these. It just shows how exactly what they're trying to get to, where it's like it's not even. To make something illegal, not reporting something that's not even illegal in the first place, it just shows what they were trying to do. And and just out these investigators.
Yeah.
They had nothing to do with cruelty.
Also, the way this was phrased, where it says, shall submit any unedited photographs or video recordings to law enforcement authorities. So that looks like that there's probably a due process issue there in terms of the seizure of their property. They recorded this, and they have to turn over every recording of it without due process. Do you want to follow up with?
Yeah, so that was the first version of the bill that was introduced. And then they just kind of sat back and watched the landscape, because November 2013 was the year that we had 13 different Ag-gag bills introduced. So New Hampshire introduced theirs right in January, and just kind of sat back and watched everything shake out at the other state levels. And they saw kind of what worked and what didn't work. And so they then amended their bill to say, here, read my eyes. So they got a little smarter about it, and they scaled it back. So now they say anyone who witnesses another person committing those acts of cruelty to livestock or poultry, which they added, has a duty to report within 48 hours. And if you, so it wasn't actually requiring to turn over your evidence directly, and it wasn't. But if you, once you make that report, you have to notify the law enforcement that you have that evidence, and you'll keep an unedited copy for 60 days. So it wasn't compelling you to actually turn anything over directly. But then this really, as Colorado got smart based on this, but the big argument here was that if this really is about stopping animal cruelty, why is it only limited to livestock? Why not apply it to all animals? And so, as I mentioned earlier, New Hampshire has the largest English-speaking legislative body, the fourth largest in the world, behind India's parliament, the British parliament, and the U.S. Congress. And so, and it's a very small state, so most of these people are at home. So because there's 450 of them, all the animal protection groups got together and said, well, this takes a lot of personal power. Like, let's all divvy these up. So we each took 20, and we called them at home and saying, hey, have you heard about this bill? And most of them, it was first they'd ever heard of it. And it was great being able to educate them directly. But most of them had that thing, well, wait a minute, this is an anti-cruelty thing. Why is an animal protection group against this? But this very last one is just so dastardly, which kind of got to what I was talking about before. It shall be a defense to prosecution under this section if the person witnessing the acts of cruelty reasonably believes his or herself to be criminally liable for the conduct of the actor, aka your employee. So the previous version of the bill, someone said, like, well, wait a minute. If you then witness one of your own employees committing this livestock cruelty, then you're under a duty to report it. And they're like, oh, that's the last thing we ever want. So they inserted this thing to exempt themselves. Just dastardly. These were the questions. And there were 70 organizations. ASPCA hired a contract lobbyist up there and had some other folks working. And it was a huge coalition, like I said, as you showed with the graphics earlier. Civil liberties groups, worker labor groups, food safety.
The ACLU, unlike in Wyoming and Montana, where we've been working on these bills lately, does have a lot of power in New Hampshire, and they were really helpful on that one.
Yeah.
In particular.
And so yeah, should I?
Yeah, start off there.
So this, now they've taken a step further. Rather than just trying to...
That bill was defeated, did we say that?
Yeah. So at the very end there. So we got a table. This was, I mean, right off the bat, January 20, very early in the session. This was like the first big victory of last year. And I was honestly surprised by how quickly we were able to kill this. I really thought this was going to be the one that snuck through. So it really boded well for how these quick reporting bills were going to fare, given that was the primary strategy of the Ag Alliance. So rather than just try to kind of put themselves this wolf in sheep's clothing thing, in Arizona, the cattlemen, because what you see a lot of places is that the Farm Bureau or these cattlemen's groups will come in and they will take a bill that has nothing to do with agriculture, even specifically exempts agriculture, that only provides benefits to companion animals, and they'll still come in and kill it just to kind of show that they can. And because they believe, maybe correctly, that any improvement in the welfare of any animal eventually is going to come back to bite them and lead to increases in farmed animal protection and farmed animal welfare.
The slippery slope argument.
Which may be true, to be honest. I mean, I think that's the way society works. Is when you have protections for some, it usually the circle never usually gets smaller. Let's put it that way. So I don't know how much. Yeah, I don't know how much I'd say that publicly, but I think it's pretty true.
I think we're being recorded here.
I didn't say that at all. Strike that, reverse it.
It's okay. We support recording.
Yeah. So basically what happened here is that the Arizona cattlemen came in, and there was a bill the year before that Katie Brophy-McGee had introduced that it just defined hoarding, it made that a crime, and it it required some psychological counseling for those convicted of animal cruelty. But they just came in and killed it, said, we're not going to let you do this. So afterwards, they went to her and said, you know that little bill that we killed? We'll let you have your little protections for your cats and dogs if you allow us to tack on next session our like top 10 wish list of terrible things we'd like to do to livestock. And completely behind closed doors, excluded all the humane community within her own state from being involved, and took that deal. Basically throwing livestock under the bus for a couple added protections for cats and dogs. And so this is the bill that came out of that, and it is literally like the top 10 worst things you could wish for.
Yeah, we just called it the kitchen sink bill. I mean,
Yeah.
that would
So
be bad for him.
as I mentioned at lunch, it would completely have removed livestock from the protections of the existing animal cruelty code, put them in a separate code that would only be administered by the Department of Agriculture. It would had a quick reporting thing requiring any evidence of cruelty to livestock to be turned over in 5 days. We're forbidden police and sheriffs from even investigating cruelty to livestock, and put that solely in the hands of the Department of Agriculture. So Sheriff General Arpaio, who has some issues, civil liberties issues in other areas, he's very strong on animals, and he's like, the Department of Agriculture in Arizona only has 7 investigators. I've got 17 just in my county. So you're going to say that they're going to be able to cover the same amount? And it was also unclear whether horses, this applied to horses. It would prohibit counties, cities and counties from ever enacting stronger anti-cruelty laws regarding livestock. Huge additional exemptions. And here's where it gets, no, it's just going to be equal. We want it's separate but equal. We're going to just take them out and we'll put them in this other code, but it's going to be just the same. We're going to treat them just the same. Except for this, like, oh, and by the way, we're going to reduce cruelty to livestock down from an existing felony back down to a misdemeanor. So that shows exactly what their intent was here. And so, as I mentioned at lunch, you had this incredibly strong polling on this. Even rural, urban, Republican, Democrat. And Chloe mentioned some of the ballot initiatives where Humane Society primarily first went into Florida and passed a livestock confinement bill that banned gestation crates. And it passed. Where you kind of, to your question earlier, when you asked about how do you get around the power of the lobbyists, you go to a ballot initiative where the voters directly are deciding on these issues. So that first happened in Florida, and it passed. Arizona was the second state where they then added fuel crates, I think, before going to California with Prop 2 and adding battery cages, and that was sort of the granddaddy. And I think there's more coming next year. That's a great thing about ballot initiatives. The number you need to get on the ballot is based on voter turnout, and the turnout was so abysmal in the midterms last year that brings the threshold really low. So I think you're going to see ballot initiatives all over the place for the 2016 election. And so we're all involved in this. Same thing, there was like 70 different groups, a coalition, and a lot of great groups on the ground, and a mix of national organizations. But it kind of looked like this was going to go through regardless. And so our own lobbyists, the folks that we've been working with on the ground there, we're sort of advising the coalition saying, you know what, and one more, back this up. One of the major local animal protection groups in Arizona did sort of get picked off initially, and we're going to switch their position to neutral, which may not sound like that big of a deal, but when you're a legislator, that's a huge deal. You've got either support, oppose, or neutral. And when you switch to neutral, that basically means your organization isn't going to beat a legislator up for voting for something. And it was revealed, and in doing the deal with the devil again, the cattlemen announced this deal with the animal protection group before they had told any of us, even having been on a strategy call with us like the day before, and all hell broke loose, and they ended up seeing the light and rejoining the fold and telling the cattlemen to take a hike. But even so, after that all happened, a few weeks later, our lobbyists came to us and said, like, you know what, this thing's going to pass, we're sorry, but you might want to think about switching to neutral because there's a lot of your friendlies here who feel they have to vote for this, and they don't want to get beaten up, and they don't want to be marked down on your humane voter scorecard and stuff. And so we had a very serious call about this. And the ultimate, my point was like, how can we do what we just beat the hell out of this other group for doing? And also, we all kind of discussed, I think what came out of it is like, there's no way we can go back to any of our supporters and say that we don't oppose a bill that's going to remove livestock from the cruelty code. I mean, it's just like fundamentally, like, how can any of us agree to that? And we stuck to our guns, like, well, if we're going to go down, we're going to go down swinging at least. And we held strong. And then what happened, sometimes you get good, sometimes you get lucky. The Senate sponsor of the bill, Pierce, got into what I think Black's Law Dictionary defines as a pissing match with the Senate, with the head of the Senate, and what happened over the budget, something completely unrelated. So in return, the Senate President's like, well, I'm just not gonna let your stupid livestock bill come up for a
Got
vote.
lucky.
Yeah, and so all of a sudden we get this phone call like, hey, the session just ended, and guess what? This never came up for a vote. So we won. But again, we kind of won more by luck than skill. But it just goes to show that sometimes you never know what's going to happen legislatively, and it pays to stick to your guns. Do you want to talk more about the 2015?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, a very similar bill was resurrected in 2015, and we were expecting this. We knew that this bill would be coming back because of the way that things broke down last
They
session.
knew that we got lucky too, and then they would have had us, so they were like, we're just going to come after you next session.
So, removes, here, let me just get all of these up, removes livestock into its own separate section, prohibits localities from enacting stronger measures, requires notifying the Department of Ag of Investigations. So that's what we talked about earlier. We didn't call this bill Ag-gag, but it probably would have had a detrimental effect on investigations. There was a 2011 investigation into Butterball in North Carolina, 2007, where the law enforcement agency with oversight over the investigation notified the state vet, who then tipped off the subjects of the investigation, and it compromised the integrity of that investigation. So there is precedent for this, and I think, if we're identifying trends and what we might see in the future, I think we're going to see more of this, just trying to give the Department of Agriculture and these states more oversight over these investigations. So saying, hey, if this investigation is going on, you just have to let the Department of Agriculture know, and then they can decide whether to continue, and they'll be involved at that point. That's my guess.
Yeah. If I could just add in, but it wasn't defined. So theoretically, this could have been applied to undercover investigations as well. It just said investigation. So everyone just assumed, because they tried to prohibit local law enforcement from enforcing cruelty to livestock before, that's just what this meant. And all of a sudden, like, well, wait a minute, like, why wouldn't this apply to an undercover investigation? So all of a sudden, it became a lot more serious.
No, yeah, definitely. And then ultimately this passed, kind of skipping over some of the details.
I think this detail is important. I just want to say that.
Say the details.
So what can happen is that you think you kill a bill, you stop it, you bottle it up, and they can do what's called like a striker bill or a zombie bill, where the session moves on right towards the end of the session. They can take an existing bill and do what's called a strike below, where they just strike everything below the first word and completely cut and paste another bill that has already died. So all of a sudden, towards the end of the session, you can have this bill that you thought it killed just show up with a different number, and like, oh no, it's this other bill that's already moved through committee, and we're just jacking all this other language into it. And so
anything can happen. We never declare victory in anything before session is over, and even then sometimes. So you just never know. And so this bill was revived and then was sent to the governor. And again, we did have this big coalition working on it. And what had happened that was very much in our favor was, because we knew this bill was coming and there was an election, people asked the gubernatorial candidates what they thought about this issue. And Governor Ducey was on record answering a question about, do you think that farm animals deserve the same protections as other animals? And he said, yes, I do. I think they deserve just as strong of protections. And so he had said this in a public way, and I think this really helped us for him to be on the record, and that gave us a glimmer of hope. I mean, it is difficult to get a veto, really difficult, but that gave us a glimmer of hope that he might be inclined to veto this bill. Chris, do you want to talk more about the campaign?
A little bit. Well, just that. Sometimes people want to do the right thing, and like I said, they're legislators. Their job is anyone in elected office, their kind of primary job in their mind is to get reelected. So you need to convince them that what you are asking them to do is going to further that goal. And so that's what we did. And I'm not sure what. So as we talked about the polling, here's that actual polling. So women voted. This is just not. These are actual voters. Female voters. In Arizona, said 91% of them said that livestock should not be removed from the cruelty code. But these are really important. Like 85% of Republicans. There's even some more that included some rural urban. But yeah, 87% of the voters. So when you're a governor, I mean that's pretty golden. But even with this polling, the cattlemen had put so much money in that folks, the local legislators were so beholden to them that it still passed even with this polling. However, the governor is much more likely to be less impacted by that. Okay, so I thought I had the numbers up there, but yeah, like I said, the numbers were, it was
It's on
19,000.
the next one, actually.
Oh, is it? Okay. Oh yeah, here we go. So here's the language that he used when this veto came out, and it surprised us all.
Yeah.
I mean, when this happened and passed through, Matt Dominguez, who couldn't be here today, he parachutes in and he's on the ground for a week doing everything he can, organizing the grassroots folks, and he just sends this text out and said, veto, 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 veto. And says, I know we all agree that animal cruelty is inexcusable, unacceptable, and absolutely will not be tolerated in the state of Arizona. I mean, to even imagine 15 years ago that you would have a governor of a state saying something like that is pretty astounding. No animal should be the victim of abuse. Moreover, perpetrators should be held to account and properly penalized to the fullest extent of the law. This is just gold. And so what they went and said, like, yeah, we know the line that you're trotting out to explain why you're doing this, but we know why you're really doing this, and we're just not going to fall for it. But again, to have a Republican governor do this in a Republican state in something with one of his state's largest industries is behind. And so yeah, here are those numbers I talked about. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty easy math for a governor to do. Like, this is going to piss off 3 people and make 19,248 voters happy. Like, that's pretty simple math.
If there's a state to rival Missouri, enter Kentucky.
So yeah, we'll just walk through these together because, man, it's just nuts.
So Kentucky's strategy basically for Ag-gag for the last 2 sessions now has been to tack an Ag-gag measure onto what would have been a pro-animal bill in 2014, or this year is kind of was it a pro? What,
yeah,
was
there
it
are
the
2
B
of
bill
them.
this
Yeah.
year? Yeah.
It's kind of hijacking a bill like forcibly rather than doing a deal.
Exactly, and this was really this makes it doubly painful for us because it meant that our the sponsor of this gas chamber bill, who's a great legislator for animal issues, had to then put all of this energy into killing her own bill to ensure that it didn't pass. It is much easier to it's easier for our side than to kill that bill because it's controlled by it's harder for the opposition to amend and pass a bill that somebody else's, that the sponsor of that bill doesn't like. The sponsor does retain usually some control over their bill, but it really was damaging in that we had to then turn around and kill this bill that so many advocates and so much energy had been put into.
Yeah, and just financially, you expend twice the resources. So after spending the entire legislative session, having all the major animal groups send action alerts out to their supporters, and getting them to engage and getting them to make calls and say, we really support this gas chamber bill, we really want your vote on this bill, and give them the number, and so everyone gets, okay, we're going to pass this thing. And then all of a sudden this poison pill gets added, so you have to throw the car in reverse and then call everyone back and say, no, don't vote for this now. Like that's a lot of time and energy and resources. And so the message is they win either way. So either it passes and they get their Ag-gag provision, or it fails and they see that's what you get for trying to protect animals in Kentucky. So yeah, you had this gas chamber bill added Ag-gag. Then there was a dogfight. The same legislator, Joni Jenkins in Kentucky. There was a dogfighting bill, anti-dogfighting bill, that they added an anti-abortion provision to. So kind of like the ag industry, the dog breeders, puppy mill folks, they pretty much oppose any companion animal protection ever. And my wisecrack about this is like, well, this may be the one bill that the breeders actually support. So as you said, Joni Jenkins has to work to kill her own, the huge resource drain. And this is the granddaddy of all. This year, there was a Kentucky bill. So the most basic requirements you have for animals are food, water, shelter, vet care. I mean, that's about as basic as it gets. Kentucky's still stuck at water. So they've got food and water. They don't even have shelter yet. You don't have to provide shelter for your dog that's outside 365 days a year. So just simply trying to add shelter. And so what the committee is like, okay, we'll pass you a little bill, only after we tack on a rider saying that every dog owner has to go acquire pet health insurance under the Affordable Care Act for their dogs. It's just a way of them like giving an extra flip of the bird to Obamacare as well as animal protection.
Another theme of both Kentucky and Missouri,
Yeah.
symbolic legislation opposing Obamacare.
Yeah. But finding a way to
Tacked
protect.
onto
And
animals.
there's a requirement things be germane. So the only way you can make it germane was saying, okay, well you have to get pet insurance for your dog under Obamacare. It's just again, the same thing, so, yeah, Wyoming, you should.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was glad that that Justin touched on Wyoming earlier. I'm just going to put all these. So in 2013, there was just a traditional bill, Ag-gag bill in Wyoming, and it was defeated. And actually, the legislator that sponsored the bill died. And we thought that the bill probably died with her, and in many ways it did. But at the same time, there was an interim committee studying this problem of resource data collection. And as Justin mentioned, this was triggered by the Western Watersheds Project's collection of water samples. And there was actually legislation to address it in the 2013 session as well, but it was not nearly as harmful as the legislation that was then introduced in 2015. So in 2015, legislation to address this resource data collection problem was introduced, and they actually just started, this was like one of the biggest themes in the legislature for the entire year. It's one of their biggest issues. They spent a ton of time and resources debating this issue on the floor, and there were multiple bills very similar, and there were a bunch of really similar bills that all passed that said like the exact same thing but slightly different words. So I don't know, good luck dealing with that. So as introduced, makes it a crime to collect resource data, which again, it's defined very broadly and includes any data pertaining to agriculture, land, minerals. It has a whole list of what it includes without authorization from the property owner. And not just authorization from the property owner to be on the land, but to collect the data itself. So you could have authorization to be on the land, say you're an employee, but so I have authorization to be here, but then I would have to not just have authorization to be there as an employee, but to collect the resource data, so to take a picture or something like that. And then this is the provision that was in the 2015 bill that we hadn't seen before. It also makes that resource data inadmissible as evidence in court, besides as evidence for committing the crime of collecting resource data. So as passed, this, and then quickly I just wanted to explain a little bit of our strategy here. I mean, this bill had a ton of momentum. When bills come out of interim committees in a state like Wyoming where they're only in every other year, this committee had spent a long time working on this issue and there was a lot of momentum behind it. So we felt from the beginning pretty strongly that something was going to pass. There was too much at stake. Something was going to pass. So we tried kind of, to be honest, a bit of a save ourselves strategy. I mean, we didn't want any of this bill to pass, but we attempted to amend the bill to exclude resource data pertaining to animal health, treatment, and welfare, so that photographs and videos of investigations could still be included. But you guys probably can see that there are still some problems with that. I mean, from those panel presentations in the morning, there's value to animal protection, also to collecting water samples in itself, and we just knew that that wasn't something we were going to be able to touch. So we wanted to attempt to kind of, a harm reduction strategy. And also sometimes adding these amendments can just slow down a bill and overcomplicate things, muddy the waters, and create, as much discord as possible between the two chambers. So something like what happens in Arizona where we get lucky can happen. So, a lot went back and forth between the chambers, and what ended up passing was a bill that, resource data was still defined very broadly, but the definition of collect was changed so that only resource data that was submitted or intended to be submitted to a state or local agency was actually covered under this bill. So, is there a loophole here? Why not just release the data publicly and then see what happens? What if maybe it got into the hands of a state or local agency? And I think the work that the groups that are doing these whistleblower investigations are doing, we certainly want those to go to state agencies for the value of law enforcement and bring those abusers to justice. But I think we have a very strong argument that they are not intended to be submitted to a state or local agency. They are intended to be released to the public so that these abuses can be exposed to the public. The legislature went to great lengths to argue that this wasn't an Ag-gag bill. Don't characterize this as an Ag-gag bill. And the sponsor of the bill on the floor started by giving this long speech about how this isn't an Ag-gag bill. It's totally different from 2013. This is about addressing trespass and protecting private property. But then they voted down the amendment that I was talking about earlier to make it very clear that it wasn't Ag-gag. So it's not entirely clear, unfortunately. But this is something that the governor issued when he signed the bill into law. We had asked for a veto of this bill. So he issued this statement saying, this is not Ag-gag, this has nothing to do with animals or animal protection. So, you know, I hope that groups will still do investigations in there, and I hope that the governor's statement has some kind of relevance if that were ever to be challenged. But that, yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna open it up. So,
Well, I would
yeah.
say, so, but if you really look at the language in this statement, it's very cleverly
Yeah.
worded. So he talks about what the legislation is aimed at, but it doesn't really matter what it's aimed at if it still applies to something else. You can say, well, I didn't intend to pass a law that makes it illegal to report that a restaurant has its fire exits chained, but yet it doesn't change the fact that it still might be illegal under the law. They're saying, well, that wasn't our intent. So kind of intent has not that much to do with it. But at the very end, it says, it's important to know that this bill does not prevent the legal collection of data, but yet the bill is actually making that data collection illegal.
Yeah.
So because we're not preventing legal collection of data, but in the process itself, they're making a bunch of that data collection itself illegal. So it's a really cleverly worded thing to make it sound like it's saying something and it's actually not.
But I mean, the fact that the legislature and the governor went to such lengths to try to demonstrate that this bill is not Ag-gag, I think is testament to the work that the coalition has done in defeating all of these bills, and the value of these undercover investigations, and a recognition that, you know, in a state like Wyoming, where agriculture is very sacred and has a lot of power, the people still hold some power.
And yeah, and if there is any litigation over this, Exhibit A, like if you try to enforce this against an investigator like TJ, you say, well, the governor himself said when he was signing it, this is what he intended it to do. So I think this could actually have a bigger impact than they hoped it might, this statement.
Justin, do you think this is an escape clause? How you can, that the data has to be submitted or intended to be submitted to?
Criminal defense lawyer, you would not want to advise a client to say you're not going to be arrested.
Want me to go stand in front of the camera?
Because you can release it to the public without it. You didn't intend, right? I mean, we have to imagine that they only need probable cause to arrest you for collecting resource data with the intent. We don't actually need them to distribute it to a state or federal agency.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Right. I'm afraid, but.
All right, cool. Well, that's what we've got for you today. I don't know if we have time for questions. We talk a lot. We were even supposed to have a third person here, so.
Lord help you guys.
We are running a little over time, but maybe if you have like one question or two questions, we can do that. So if anybody.
I get a good one. Go ahead, Tom.
When a bill is being, sorry.
No.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, well, I have a question about sort of the effectiveness of these ballot initiatives that are coming up. I think there's 8 states now that
Sure.
have gestation crate bans that are either at the
Sure.
record or coming up. I'm wondering about the effectiveness sort of at the ground level, because what we've sort of seen with Prop 2 is that so I'm sorry, I'm an animal scientist, so I come at it from a very different point of view. Some producers have sort of moved to barn, a little bit more moved to enriched cages, but a lot of producers have just started calling birds in battery cages to meet the space requirements. So there's a lot of battery cages that still exist. So
Birds assuming it would be culled anyway.
Oh no, I'm not saying they're culled. Like
Oh.
what I'm saying is they're still in battery cages,
Gotcha.
but they're being culled to meet the space requirement. So, and nobody wants to touch enforcement in California. So I'm just a little curious as to how Prop 2 has actually affected change on the ground for hens.
David, do you have
Someone from the audience?
No, David, do you
I
have
can take a crack at it, and I can answer it. So I'm David Wilson. That's part of the team that did Prop 2. So,
okay. Well, I'm with World Animal Protection too. I guess it's the
okay, great. So, I mean, it's a great question. I think Prop 2 is particularly distinct in terms of ballot initiatives, in terms of the focus on battery cages. When you're talking about the gestation crate ones and the veal crate ones, those are so much easier to address all of your concerns, because you're dealing, the way the language is drafted is you're dealing with one animal and space requirements.
But isn't that even harder then? That's even
No, that's easier.
Okay.
Look,
Sorry. Go
yeah,
ahead.
right. So what I mean by that is, I mean, first you got to remember these ballot initiatives, right? So when they were enacted, they go through a popular a whole series of, of campaigning, and you ultimately have to persuade people to vote in favor, and it means you can draft them. It's very difficult to draft them. There's no back and forth. You can't make them perfect, and you want to make sure that they get passed. When I meant the gestation bill being easier, it's like the language is very clear. It's like you've got to give the bill baby calf or the pig enough space to turn around. And it seems, from what we've seen, that once you give an animal enough space to turn around, and once you make the crate big enough to do that, the economics of the system don't work anymore, and you don't have the crates anymore, and you move to a group housing system. Now we can have an absolutely appropriate debate about whether a group housing system is better or worse than a gestation crate or a veal crate. That's the other issue. With the battery cage, the problem with the battery cage, honestly, having been involved in it, was that language to draft it and get the pass was incredibly difficult to draft. And what would have been perfect would have been something that had space requirements, like actual measurements, but the likelihood of that passing through a ballot was very, very low. So we ended up with this very broad language of birds being able to spread their wings without touching the sides of the enclosure or anyone else, which meant that there has been a great deal of difficulty in understanding exactly what that means. And uncertainty about quite what's going to happen in California. But what I have been told, we may have better information than I have, is that you're right. I mean, it may be that some animals are being killed in order just to make the cages have less animals in them. But from what I've been told is there seems to be generally a move away from the battery cage to some type of other system, which you can appropriately question whether it's better or not for the animals. In terms of the enforcement side of it, every one of the ballot measures that have been passed have had very squishy enforcement provisions. And interestingly, none of them, other than maybe the battery cage one, has had any issues about enforcement. The problem again is if you go to the population and say we want to pass a law that has criminal offenses to farmers, and we'll put these people in prison, people don't want to vote for those. So you have to make the language somewhat squishy and just hope that it will phase out. And in the case of the gestation crate and the veal crate stuff, that's been easy. The battery cage has been much, much more complicated. But I don't think I answered the question.
I think to add to that, as far as effect on the ground, I think the ballot initiatives have been fantastic, not only because you're anchoring into law, but you're also very much educating people about the issue. So Governor Christie vetoing the New Jersey gestation crate bill that passed, that again had 93% support by the voters, and passed overwhelmingly twice. His delaying his veto and then finally vetoing it was gold to the animal protection community, because it allowed us to trumpet that all over the national news media. Daily Show did umpteen reports on it, MSNBC, and it made him look really bad, but it allowed us to kind of educate people like, this is what a gestation crate is. Most people didn't even know. But several of the large producers, so in tandem with actually passing legislation, one thing that Humane Society has been really fantastic about is targeting directly the retailers. So rather than battling, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, the strategy was to argue with producers, and if it costs a producer 1/100th of 1 penny per egg, it's economically not worth it for them. And they've got no incentive because there's no penalty for them by not doing what you want them to do. Whereas, places like McDonald's, Safeway, they're essentially marketing and delivery vehicles. They're not producers. And so by targeting them, saying, hey, when DiGiorno Pizza, we're gonna have this cow hanging in the air right next to your logo and blanket that everywhere, that scares the hell out of them. And so you've seen, Safeway, which is like I think the second largest grocery retailer in the country, all these other chains, both grocery stores and restaurants, saying like, well, yeah, we're not going to have we're not going to accept meet this rate with gestation crates. And so all of a sudden there's no market. You can find all you want over here, but the producers turn around and just find there's not a market for the product. So Smithfield is the single largest pork producer in the world, and they're switching to go gestation crate free. And my previous incarnation was working on vet malpractice issues and beating up the vets a lot on some of their positions. And here there's a class in Chicago that Joyce Tischler taught on farm animal protection. She had a person from the AVMA come in, and she's like, oh, you need these gestation crates, the American Veterinary Medical Association. So you've got to have these gestation crates, because if you don't, these pigs will fight. And if you think a dog fight's bad, just wait till you see a pig fight. And literally 2 days later, had the head of Smithfield come in, like, we haven't had any problems at all moving to group housing. It's been pretty successful, and this little pilot program we did, we're gonna expand. So here you have,
the American Veterinary Medical Association lagging behind actual producers when it comes to farm animal welfare. It's pretty astounding. So that's where I think the real hope is in some of this stuff is really, because that's another way to channel, as I was talking earlier about all these polls, rather than kind of doing a ballot initiative, it's sort of like a corporate ballot initiative of getting people to sort of vote with their dollars and getting the retailers to realize what a black eye they'll get out of continuing to do these, or support these practices.
So I think that's all the time we have.
Sorry, well, you asked a quick question, like, we'll let you go.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, when
Sorry.
a legislator wants to, and I'm sorry, this might take us really over, but when a legislator wants to propose a bill and it often goes to the agricultural committee, where I think it'll be found with a lot of opposition, right? Because a lot of,
Well, it depends.
Well, I mean, isn't the farming community mostly?
Well, it depends which side you're on. So
I'm
if it's an ag bill like this farm thing, they want that to go to the ag committee because they know it's going to sail through. But if it's an animal protection bill,
Yeah,
you're
I'm
saying
talking
the trick is to get it to the judiciary.
Yeah, I think she's asking what we want.
Yeah.
Right.
Right, so is there a way to control what committee it goes to, like as a legislator who's proposing the bill?
It's different in every state, but typically, like, leadership assigns bills to committees, but committee chairs often, like, if they want a bill, they have a lot of power to say, so agriculture committee chairs will say, oh, I want this bill in my committee, if leadership is willing to redirect it. In some states, bills have multiple committee assignments, so like in Florida, bills usually have to get through about 3 committees, North Carolina 2, so it's different in every state, but there is some control in some states more than others about which committees bills go to. Like in Montana this year, we had a puppy mill bill that's always gone to ag and been killed, instead go to the Business and Labor Committee, which deals with issues of regulating businesses, which is really what puppy mills are. It's not an ag issue. And so we had much more success. I mean, the bill still died, but only by 1 vote.
And what you're saying is very relevant for New York because a lot of the anti-cruelty stuff goes through
That's
ag markets.
exactly what I'm talking
yeah.
about, the Consolidated Animal Crimes
Yeah.
Bill. It's with the Agricultural Committee, and I understand that the last legislative session it died,
Yeah.
because that's where it was. So I want to know, like, this next legislative session, can it go to a different committee?
It depends state by state. Some are
Yeah.
required to go, some don't. And as Justin has talked, he had the speaker of the Colorado House come and talk to his class a few times. And he says, I've got a committee, I just staff for all the people, it's called my kill committee. I don't like something I can just throw it there and just make sure it dies. And that's a lot of the strategy that goes into this is if you've got a friendly in leadership, you can go to them and they can kind of help you sculpt where something goes. But sometimes it's ordained, it has to go to a certain committee, other times that's a part of the strategy. Thanks a lot.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much.